Hi, everybody. I'm not going to say anything about the significance of this day, but I hope to be able to control myself. I was commiserating with my colleagues what a day this has been. But for those of you who attend this forum for the first time, and I see some new names, please welcome. Allow me to welcome you to the Autism Professional Development and Professional Practice series that we host by the San Diego State Center for Autism. In this forum, we highlight topics of interest and diverse disciplinary perspectives for professional practice in the field of autism. The objective of this forum and these talks is to represent diverse and different professional fields that support, instruct, or work with children and adults with autism and their respective best practices. In our past talks, as some of you may know, who have attended our past talks, we've highlighted best practices in the fields of School of Psychology, behavioral interventions, special education law, practice of clinical psychology, just to name a few, with more recent talks this past semester focusing on more pressing and timely topics, including cultural competency and clinical practice adaptations to the current pandemic. Today, I'm very honored to host Dr. Sam Odom, the former director of the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at UNC at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he remains as a senior research scientist. Dr. Odom is a graduate of University of Tennessee, where he completed his undergrad degree in psychology and master's degree in special education and educational psychology. He completed his doctoral training in special education at the University of Washington in Seattle and postdoctoral training at the Western Psychiatric Institute at the University of Pittsburgh. He was professor of special education in Vanderbilt, UNC, and Indiana U. And as I said, he served as the director of the Child Development Institute, one of the oldest research institutes studying childhood and families at UNC for more than 10 years. Dr. Odom is the author and co-author of over 200 journal articles and book chapters and has edited 10 books on early childhood intervention and developmental disabilities. His research funded over decades really by the Institute of Education Sciences, Institute of Education Sciences, IES, a part of the US Department of Education, has been addressing treatment efficacy for children and youth with autism, identification of evidence-based practices, and implementation science. In his talk today, Dr. Odom will review evidence-based practice movement in autism intervention research and describe what he calls the 3 generations of EBP, evidence-based practices. I have asked Dr. Odom to speak for about 45, 50 minutes, and we will have time for questions at the end of his talk. Please help me welcome Dr. Odom, and he will introduce his talk, I think, and you can take it from here.
Okay, well, thank you, and very pleased, honored to be part of this series. I want to start with a provision that if there's any breaking news during the midst of this talk, please share it. Evidence-based practices for children with autism is very important to me, but we have to think about the whole other context that we're living in today. So, but hopefully we'll get through this without interruptions, I guess. Start off. So I want to start off by just acknowledging the funding that has been the basis for our work. Institute of Education Sciences, Department of Education, the U.S. Institutes of Health. There's a T32 grant that funded a postdoc that was with us, the Ireland Foundation in North Carolina. Mr. John Rucker was a donator in the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. And I also want to share my team, our team. Kara Hume and Jessica Dykstra, it says here. Steinbrenner is actually her name now. Are two of the leaders of the work that we have done on evidence-based practices. But this was really a cast of hundreds anyway. But these were the central members of the team that have worked on the findings that you'll hear about today. I'm going to briefly today review evidence-based practice movement, the evidence-based practice movement and autism intervention research, describe previous EBP work that we have done, describe the current review, which I call the third generation, and I'll explain what that means in just a few minutes, and report on the results of that review, and then just discuss implications. If you're here today, there's sort of a variety of people that are here. I know some students from undergraduate, graduate classes, clinical psychology, special education, some professionals from the field. You probably have a background already in autism spectrum disorder, so I'm not going to say very much about it. I'm assuming you have that knowledge. You know that it's characterized by, at least through DSM-3, by social communication challenges and restricted repetitive behavior. We know that that the prevalence, at least from the CDC, for children is 1 in 54. Autism affects boys about 4 times as often as girls. That's we know that white children and Black children, African American children, are a little more likely to be diagnosed with autism than Hispanic children. We think that's because of diagnostic sort of practices and access to care that makes that difference. And about 1/3 of children with autism also have intellectual disabilities, and that's very much a change over the decades. At one time, autism was thought, or intellectual disability was thought to co-occur with autism at a much higher rate. But the prevalence has gone up. When I first started working in the field, which was actually right over here in the early 80s, the prevalence was around 2 in 10,000 children. And as you can see, it has steadily increased across years. I want to give a shout out to Kathy Lord, who's a professor at UCLA and really one of the pioneers in the field of assessment and diagnosis of children with autism. She wrote or was a co-author of a really interesting history about autism as it has developed over the years, as well as treatment that has occurred over the years. And this reference is in the reference list that's at the end of this presentation, but it sort of highlights the significant features that have happened across the year with at least the current conceptualizations of autism through Connor and Asperger, the iterations of the DSM diagnostic measures, the treatments that began early on with Lovas and Shopler, and on through the significant features today of DSM-5, elaboration of early intervention programs. So I'll just, if you have an interest in autism and want to learn more about where it came from, where the current thinking about autism identification and treatment came from, that's a great, I think, background. An interesting thing about autism is that it tends to attract treatments that are not standard or traditional. Some of these treatments were described in a book by Syrian Lyons. You can see the range, which is called Cutting Edge Therapies for Autism, and it includes a range of therapies that we might wonder about. We do know that most of these therapies that are listed on this slide do not have strong or any evidence of effectiveness for children with autism. The concern often is that that without firm kind of evaluations and vetting and translating information about research for practitioners and families, they may be attracted to engage in these treatments for their children, which may be harmful for their children, certainly expensive, or they may just not have any effects, but take up the time that could be used otherwise. Owen Smith and colleagues in 2015 did a survey of families asking them about the complementary or alternative medicines that they employed, and 69% of the families said that yes, they had used alternative treatments, complementary treatments or medicines with their child in the previous 3 months. And there's a description over to the right side of the slide about the different kinds of treatments that were applied. So at best, they may not be harmful. But again, in terms of expense and time and energy that families put into treatments that may not have effects, they can create, I think, harm in those ways. We have spent a number of years, starting in 2007, examining evidence-based practices for children with autism. These research-based practices are propelled or required actually by federal law, both in general education and in special education. Clinical practice also is governed by ethics. The use of evidence-based practices in clinical practice is also governed by evidence or ethics and insurance that pays for those clinical treatments. Evidence-based practices in our field, in special education and in clinical psychology, has emerged out of the evidence-based medicine movement that began back in the 70s with Archie Cochran and group. At that time, Cochran, who was a physician, was dismayed that much of the health care that was being provided in England was not really based on evidence, and in fact also that the kinds of research that was happening there wasn't being conducted in a way that would provide the kind of information that would be necessary for healthcare workers. This is not for children with autism, but this is a broader field of healthcare. So he proposed that randomized clinical trials or randomized studies of effective interventions should be the basis for us identifying practices, evidence-based practices in medicine. This notion of evidence-based medicine grew out of his work and was very much moved forward by David Sackett's work in Canada to ensure that there's research evidence that may be the basis of medicine. But both Cochran and Sackett make a really, really important point that that our research tells us what in our studies are proven to be effective or have efficacy. But that's just one source of information that we should use in the practices that we that we employ with children and youth with autism, or children and youth in general. They propose that evidence that information from the literature has to be blended with clinical expertise that professionals have. So you as teachers or you as clinical psychologists bring in a history, a set of expertise that allows you to select practices, to adapt them, to use them in ways that may be effective. And that combination is really critical, is really important, as is the preferences that families or patients have about the treatments that they're receiving. So that combination of information is critically important. One of the comments we've gotten about our work in evidence-based identification of evidence-based practices is about how relevant they are in terms of promoting effective practices with children and youth with autism in schools and communities, in clinical settings. So we propose that that there's a chain of development, of evidence development that occurs, that moves from the intervention research that occurs to the application of those findings with autistic children and youth. Our proposal is that high quality research is a bottom line and is important. That research is shared with the world through peer-reviewed journal articles. Those peer-reviewed journal articles may then be selected or chosen for systematic reviews that lead to the identification of evidence-based practices, and that's what you'll hear about today. But if we stop right there, we will never get to the point of a larger goal of improving care for children with autism, children and youth with autism. That is the next necessary. So what we do, what you're going to hear about today, is a part of a larger work that we do, but you're going to hear about the systematic review process and the identification of evidence-based practices. The step after that is the translation of evidence-based information into user-friendly procedures. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've done that in our work. But if the process stops right here, then it very much lowers the probability that the research that we do is ever going to have an impact for children with autism, children and youth with autism. So it requires the translation of information into user-friendly procedures, and also the application of that information with children, which we feel is facilitated through professional development and implementation science. That is, we feel that's the vehicle that moves the knowledge that we produce about evidence-based practice actually into practice. I'm going to talk about identify two types of intervention research that occurs in literature, and then focus on one specifically. So we've proposed that when you read research articles, there are some articles that are about comprehensive treatment models, that's the term that's been used. I've been not using that term very much anymore, but I'm thinking more in terms of comprehensive programs, because of treatment is sort of a pejorative term in sort of it may imply that autism is a disease that needs to be treated, which is very much not what we propose. But so comprehensive treatment or comprehensive programs for children with autism bring together a set of practices around a conceptual framework, and that set of practices are used consistently across a long period of time. So the Early Start Denver model is an example of a comprehensive treatment model, or the LEAP program by Phil Strain is an example of a comprehensive program. The LOBOS program model is a comprehensive program as an example. There's another class of studies or research that focuses on what we call focused intervention practices, and that's what I want to talk about today. Those focused intervention practices are designed to address a single skill or set of skills that are the goals of a child with or youth with autism. An example of a focused intervention practice might be discrete trial training. Another example is naturalistic interventions. Those are sort of on different ends of a continuum in terms of structure and direction, and I'll talk about both. But when we use naturalistic intervention, for example, we would use it in a way that would focus in on a specific skill that a child is maybe learning, like a communication skill, using two words to communicate in a sentence, a two-word verbalization. That practice would focus in on that skill and be used for a certain period of time until a goal is met, and then a new skill is identified, a new practice identified. Comprehensive treatment models are made up of these focused intervention practices, and again are organized around a conceptual framework. We call this the work that we're currently doing third generation, because it's the third review that we've actually done. The first began in 2007 with the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. I was the principal investigator for that center. Its purpose was to promote teachers' use of evidence-based practices in classrooms for children and youth with autism spectrum disorders. At the time that we get started, there wasn't really a set of practices that one could say had been systematically identified as being evidence-based. So at the National Autism Center in the National Standards Project was just getting underway, and it's a sort of a parallel project to the one that we've done. But they had not gotten off the ground yet. They hadn't done their review, and we needed to get started working with teachers and schools. So we conducted a review of the literature that was published between 1997 and 2007. We had to do it pretty quickly because we had to start working with states, and we decided to only include focused intervention practices, and identified 24 evidence-based practices at that time. For the National Professional Development Center, we developed materials that shared that information, and then worked with states to develop a professional development program that would use the information on evidence-based practices and would train or work with teachers to use them in their classrooms. And I'm really pleased to say that the state that has done the most work in that area is actually here in California, and the Captain Project, which has its sort of history with the National Professional Development Center. California is one of our states, and we worked with some of the leaders in the Captain Project 10 plus years ago when we got started, when it was kind of began. Anyway, the literature moves on. We realized that it was important to do a more systematic job of identifying evidence-based practices. So in our second review, we expanded the time frame for the literature that we accessed. In the second review, we included articles that were published between 1990 and 2011 and found 454 acceptable articles that resulted from the review that we conducted. And we published that. We published a report, which you see over on the right side of the screen, and an article in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. We also, I'm not going to talk much about those practices because many of them are the ones that you'll hear about in just a minute when you talk about the third generation. But I am going to introduce you to the AFIRM modules, and if you haven't seen them or used them, I really encourage you to go to this website if you have an interest in evidence-based practices for children and youth with autism. For the second review, and we've done this, and it does have implications for the third review too. We developed modules for online training modules for each of the 27 practices. These modules are designed to lead the user through an introduction to the practice, identification of the practice, an understanding of the steps that are needed to conduct the practice in their setting, and ways of selecting evidence-based practices. One question that we often get is, well, you have 27 practices. I can't learn all 27, and I can't use all 27 with the children I work with. So how do I make sense out of these 27 practices? And so the training that we provide through these modules allows the user to select practices that are matched to individual goals for children. And I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. This work was funded by the Office of Special Education Programs. Since 2015, when we began, the use of this website has grown dramatically. These data are a little bit old now, although June 2020 doesn't sound like it's that long ago, but at that point, we had 154,000 new users. So these were individuals who came to the website, went through the training for a module, and then we issue a certificate for individuals who go through the training and take a post-test, just a certificate of completion, which means that really just that they completed the module, and they know a little more now than they did before they started about that evidence-based practice. Currently, there are around 2,000 or 200,000 new users, and they mostly are in the United States, but we've had users from all over the world, really. And we've had translations of some of the modules and some of the work in Arabic, Mandarin, Italian. For most of the rest of the for all the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about this third generation of evidence-based practices. We call it, this is the National Professional Development Center on Autism funding ended in 2013. At that time, we established the national, or a little after that, the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice, which is housed within the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Its purpose is to bridge science and practice. And if you go to that website, you can download for free the information that you're going to hear today that we have published in a report. And I'll be referring to different parts of the report. It also is the home of the AFIRM modules. So if you want to access them, you can go to NCAPE, National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice. If you put that into Google, it'll take you right there. So we realized that practices are somewhat time, and the literature is somewhat time sensitive, and it moves on. In a second generation review, the articles published the articles were published through 2011. So about 2 years ago, 2+ years ago, we realized that there was a need for us to update the evidence-based practice literature because new practices may have been coming on board. The literature is accumulating. So we conducted another search, which went through the processes of identifying articles from the literature, screening them to make sure they were appropriate for our evaluation, doing a review of the articles to make sure that they met our standards for quality, and then from those articles draw out the information about the practices, which we call data extraction. I'll refer to if you're interested in systematic reviews, I'll just refer you on to the report. We followed what we think are industry standards of best practice in systematic reviews. We identified our search terms. We had inclusion, and exclusion criteria that we stated. All along the way, we tried to be as transparent as possible. We did focus on published articles in peer-reviewed journals, which left out dissertations or conference presentations that sometimes get into other reviews. Articles, we only included articles that were published in English. Again, focusing on focused intervention practices and outcomes that had relevance for children and youth that were in school, home, school, community, and clinical settings. The articles had to address a question of efficacy or the effectiveness of a practice. In the previous review, we had screened more than 29,000 articles. Again, that was published through 2011. So that's where we started our review process. So for the current review, when we looked at just the 2012 to 2017 articles, we found 61,000, and through a systematic sort of triaging process that pulled out duplicates or articles that weren't relevant or didn't fit our criteria, we eventually got down to 1,200, about 1,300 articles that seemed to be appropriate for the reviews that we wanted to do. we recruited about over 200 people to be on a review team and provided training for those individuals. They reviewed, 2 reviewers reviewed each of the 1,282 articles. And through that process, we got down to 567 articles that met our criteria. And again, I'll refer you on. The reviewers were faculty members, researchers, graduate students, practitioners, administrators. The criteria for those reviewers were that they had to have some methodological training in single case design or group design, that they have experience with children and youth with autism, and that they have a master's degree or above. So for this current 3rd generation review, we used the 427 articles from the 2011. There were some that we excluded when we did an internal review, but not many. Some excluded from the earlier review, and we've also found that in the 5 years, 2012, 2017, that preceded that were after our previous review, there were 545 articles that we identified as being appropriate. So there were almost 1,000 articles, 972 articles that are in the current review. Our criteria for evidence-based practices is that a practice has to have evidence from at least 2 group design articles, randomized group design or quasi-experimental, high-quality quasi-experimental designs, and replicated by 2 different research groups, or 5 single-case design articles that were replicated by 3 different research groups, or a combination of those 2. So when we got around 1,000 articles in what we call the data extraction stage, we identified in each of those articles, they looked at the methods section and identified what practice was supported by the research in that article. And from that, we sorted those articles into the practices that appeared to be happening at the time, using the previous categories and then new ones that developed out of our sort of content analysis. So in this review, you can see what's on this chart are the number of articles in the review and their publication year. So you can see that there's a kind of an accelerating curve of number of acceptable articles in autism intervention research that are being published. So we expect, given the direction of this curve, that since 2017, it's been 2.5 years, that a substantial number of articles, acceptable articles, have since our review been published, and that's going to be hopefully the work that we do in the future, is try to capture that information. The articles the research that's done are primarily single case design articles. We can have a discussion about single case design at some point if you all are interested, but about 85% of the articles we identified, the research studies that we identified, followed single case design. About 14% were randomized clinical trials. Almost 3% were quasi-experimental designs. In our database, the research was being done primarily with 3 to 6-year-old children and 6 to 12-year-old children. So preschool, elementary age children. We have seen an increase in the kind of the number of studies that happen with young adolescents and high schoolers. The least amount of articles were studies were done with those students who are at the end of their schooling years, so the 19 to 22-year-old articles. And we also found some diversity in race and ethnicity of the participants. Not as much as we would have liked to see, but some diversity. And the participants sort of aligned according to what we know about the demographics of autism. So I'm probably going to go all the way up to 5 o'clock. So sorry. The articles were group design. The studies mostly happened with in individual settings, but also educational settings. So in this review, we identified 28 evidence-based practices. And if you go to the report, you'll be able to get more information about specifically the definitions, the studies that provide the evidence, but antecedent-based interventions, augmentative and alternative communication interventions, behavior momentum, cognitive behavior, differential reinforcement, direct instruction, discrete trial training. One of the questions we've had is about the difference between discrete trial training and direct instruction, and I'd be glad to talk a little bit about that if there's a question. Exercise and movement, extinction, functional behavioral assessment, functional communication training, modeling, music-mediated interventions, naturalistic interventions, social narratives, like the social stories that some of you have probably used in your work, social skills training, which might be either individual or group-based. I think I skipped over one of those things, sorry. Parent implemented interventions, peer-based interventions, prompting, reinforcement, which are two of the very basic building blocks for some of the other interventions that you've read about or that you've heard about. Response, interruption and redirection, self-management, sensory integration. This has been a controversial, or at least a practice that we identified. It made it into our review with 3 RCT type studies. We've tried to make a very specific point that this sensory integration is specifically the Jean Ayres model of sensory integration and needs to be provided by individuals trained in that model. I talked about some of these technology assisted interventions, time delay, modeling, visual supports. So some of those practices were in our previous set of evidence-based practices, and some are new. AAC, behavior momentum, direct instruction, music mediated interventions, peer-based intervention and sensory integration are all new practices that emerged out of our content analysis and was part of a reorganization that we did for our practices. And some of the previous practices that had identified PECs was merged within AAC. Pivotal response training, which was a standalone practice, but it sort of stood out as also being a naturalistic intervention practices was merged into naturalistic intervention. Scripting was merged into visual support. Structured play groups, all of these being previous EBPs, was merged into peer-based interventions, and peer-mediated interventions, again, were merged into peer-based interventions. One of the new classes of evidence-based information that came up was that unfolded was what we call manualized interventions meeting criteria. That is, there's some intervention practices that fit within our broader EBPs, but have been have enough evidence on their own to be identified or called out as evidence-based. We still group them within the EBPs just because of those shared sets of procedures or practices that they of which they consist. But these, so PECS is one that I've talked about. Stepping stones, or triple P, is another practice that's a parent implemented intervention. Project Impact, also a parent implemented intervention. Social stories, Carol Gray, is social narratives. The Peers program by Liz Lageson is merged within this social skills training. The range of Jasper work that Connie Cassery has done over the years is merged in with naturalistic intervention, milieu teaching also within naturalistic intervention, PRT within naturalistic intervention, and then face-say and mind reading, sort of cognitive behavioral interventions are merged in with our technology assisted practices. So I'm going to, if you go to our report, you'll be able to look at a very complicated matrix that shows you for each of the intervention practices what the outcomes were. So academic, adaptive behavior, self-help, challenging behavior, cognitive, communication, joint attention, mental health, motor, play, school readiness, self-determination, social, vocational outcomes. All of those have come out as different sort of dependent variables or outcomes in the effectiveness studies. So the filled in cells indicate that there's a study with that outcome that occurred for this intervention. So for example, for discrete trial training, we found studies that supported pre-academic or academic behavior for young children, for elementary school-age children, and then for older children also, because all three of those are filled in. That information we use when we work with teachers to identify practices that are appropriate. In our report, we define the practice, we define the outcomes that occurred, and the ages for which those outcomes happen, and then also the articles that are identified for the practice, supporting the practice. And we have these for every one of the practices we identified. If you go to the report, you'll find that. So this is a really quick run through of a large amount of information. Our next steps that we're currently involved in are to examine issues of race and ethnicity that appear in this literature. How frequently is race and ethnicity identified? Are differential outcomes identified? Also, we're interested in differential effects for girls and women. We're interested in who the providers and implementers are, as well as research for adolescents and adults and how that is going to be unfolding in the future. our next steps are also to translate this new information that has come out of our work into those kinds of friendly materials or accessible materials for practitioners that is part of our AFIRM modules. So what you see on this last slide is the website for our National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice, as well as the AFIRM website. So these links will take you directly to the site, but it's just as easy to put it into Google and kind of go from there. So I'm going to end my presentation right now and see if there's any points that I brought up that you'd like me to talk more about, or if you have questions that you'd like to ask. So this is the time to do that.
Thank you. May I just say that I had expected to learn a lot, but this just seems like a monumental work. So I'm really in awe of the scope of what you were able to describe. And, of course, we are compromised by just learning the broad scopes of this, again, monumental work. And I'm sure there are a lot of specific questions that I have, but I'm gonna open this first for other people for any questions or comments. And while people are gathering their thoughts, maybe I can start by more of a musing, right? I mean, this again, enormous amount of work, and in terms of the methods that you use, I understand that systematic review is very different from what a meta-analysis would show, which I think what my question may require, right? Like, you may have just not looked at this again because that was not the goal of what you were trying to do. But have you noticed any objective metrics? Can you notice any age-related tendencies in how well some of these EBPs work? Again, this was not this was not the goal of your review, right? But can we learn anything about how well something works, in early childhood versus later for youth?
Yeah, I understand your question. We have been doing some research on the use and effects of teachers' implementation of these practices. So we just finished an RCT that was done in 60 schools in North Carolina, elementary schools in North Carolina. The practices, there were a range of practices that were selected, that the teachers selected. The program started with identification of goals for children and the linking of goals to the practices themselves. So over a year's time period, it's clear that with some coaching and specific planning, teachers increase the fidelity of their use. We find that that children are more successful in reaching their goals when the teachers use those practices. We find that goal accomplishment is a really important feature, but we also find that it's not necessarily reflected in some of the standardized measures that are sometimes used in RCTs, and we have some perspectives about how sensitive some traditional standardized measures are to treatment outcomes in schools. But that's a whole different issue. So I don't think I'm answering your question. What we know is that not so much about which of the practices are more effective, because the practices really apply to different types of goals. So in some ways, it's kind of a harder question to ask. For us, the importance is to establish that linkage in an appropriate way and to support teachers for using the practice, or clinicians, practitioners, in using the practice with a high level of fidelity.
So we have two comments in the chat. The first one is from Anne. Very interested in how DTT and DR are the same or different, and perhaps further information about music-mediated intervention.
Oh, I bet I know who asked that question. So how the discrete trial training and direct instruction are different. Is that right?
Yeah, how are they similar and how are they different?
How are they similar and how are they different? So the discrete trial training came out of Lobos's work, and is very much they both are very they both are adult directed, in that there's a teacher who leads the instruction. Discrete trial training is usually provided in an individual adult to single child intervention session, teaching session, although it can be done in groups, in small groups too, where there's an individual goal. The adult presents an instruction or a prompt for the skill that's being learned. They may provide support for the child engaging in that skill, and then there's usually a consequence. The other characteristic, usually for discrete trial training, is that there are mass trials, so that there are a number of opportunities for the child to practice that skill in a session. So maybe 10 or 15 or 20 skills, for 20 opportunities to learn maybe a matching task. Direct instruction has its roots in the work of Ziggy Engelman and Doug Carnine at the University of Oregon. It tends to be more of a group-led form of instruction, where the adult provides an instructional cue or instructional prompt that's based on a pretty well planned out instructional design, where the skill also happens maybe happens frequently, but the instructional design sort of builds the complexity of the skills. I'm not doing a great job in explaining this. Often, direct instruction will have choral responding to the instructional prompt or cue, and an error correction kind of sequence of practices that the teacher follows. So the primary differences between the two, I think, are in the way the examples are sequenced, that the examples of the skills that the child is going to practice, and in that form of choral responding that occurs.
A question.
So I can say also that direct instruction has been used more often for academic skills. Discrete trial training is also, but I would say direct instruction is primarily used more in that area.
Paul, did you have a question?
Yes. First, thank you for a great presentation. And just have a quick question about the report. There seems to be a variability in the amount of evidence for some of the practices. So for example, the prompting practice has 140 studies to back it up versus 3 for sensory intervention. So my question is, if I'm a special ed teacher, do you have any recommendations on how to interpret that if I need to decide on practices for my student and maybe both serve the same outcome that I'm looking for?
Right.
Does that make sense?
I think one of the important parts of moving this information into use by teachers is not only kind of learning to use the practice, but also learning to match the practice with an appropriate goal, or match the practice to a goal in an appropriate way. When I talked about evidence-based medicine, or early on in Sackett's kind of conceptualization of evidence-based medicine, he made the point that the practices are a starting point. They're sort of, you could view them kind of as candidates of teaching strategies that you might use. The other parts that go into like that decision-making process of which practice to use is based on the practitioner, the teacher or clinician's knowledge or understanding of the practice. Their prediction of how well it might work with a child, assuming that they know the child well, potentially their experience with a child and with things that have or have not worked. So I think that the guidance that we try to provide on our website about selection of practices are designed to sort of get at that process for selecting practices. So back to your question about level of evidence that's important. Some of these practices have been around for 50 years and have built up a large number of studies that support them. That does not necessarily mean they're more powerful than a practice that has just a few studies that support it. We think that that we've used high enough criteria to make all of these practices potentially good candidates for instruction. But not instruction of every single skill. So the importance is for the teachers to have some confidence in themselves about their knowledge of the child, about what they may think will work in their classroom, and not be hesitant to use that knowledge in selecting the practice in combination with that matrix I showed you that that identified the outcomes that these practices generate. That linkage between outcomes and practices and a practice is also another part of the decision-making process about which practice to choose. So if I want to jump back to Ann's question about music-mediated interventions, because I kind of skipped over that. I got carried away with direct instruction and discrete trial training. Music-mediated interventions are very, very specific approaches of using music to teach a specific skill. there are steps or features of that practice that 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 identify it as an intervention. So one could think of using music in a way of generalizing a skill that might have been been developed in a more adult-directed strategy. So it may be a way of focusing in on certain movement, motor skills. I think the point is that it's not using music in a kind of a generalized way to support a child's learning experience, but in a more focused way, using music as a setting for encouraging the child's engagement in a specific skill that you've identified. I don't know if that helps, but.
So we have another question from the chat box from Adam. Are the goals that you mentioned for treatment normally determined by the child, the parents, or usually a combination of both?
So when we work with teachers, we propose to teachers that there are different sources for selecting a goal, and for us, given that we're working in schools, these are our individualized educational goals. These are the IEP goals that the teachers are going to be developing. So the sources of information we propose are assessments an assessment or assessments the teacher may do, a criterion referenced assessment that may be useful at the beginning. The parents' priorities about what they think are important for them, for their child to learn. The needs for the child to be independent in their current setting. Their current setting may be either the home or maybe the classroom, or could be the community. When I say child, I mean youth too. I'm talking also about adolescents and teenagers. And then the future, the kind of the requirements for the child or youth's next setting, their future setting. So all of that information we encourage teachers to consider and to put into the decision-making process about selecting goals. But I think all of those things, we really, when we've worked with teachers and in schools, the involvement of parents as much as we can is really important. Understanding what their priorities are for their children. Then, of course, school priorities also are pretty critical.
I have a quick question.
The audience.
Sorry, I had a quick question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So as you know, I'm very interested in sort of social validity and the acceptability of these different practices. So I'm not sure to what extent the different studies reported on that, or if you're able to speak about that, but is that something that was considered in terms of use and obviously teachers' motivation to try out these different practices in their classrooms?
So when we reviewed the literature, we was that Megan?
Yes.
You may have reviewed some of these practices. You may have been in the last review. I don't know, but we had a protocol for reviewing a specific study and the features that needed to be in that study. So for single case design, it had to have experimental control and replication. It had to be a reliable, dependent variable. It had to describe the intervention clearly, those kinds of things. What we did not include as a specific requirement was a measurement of social validity. So we just didn't. We felt like that was a criteria that was beyond what we could expect in a systematic review like this. What we have done, though, is, for our AFIRM modules that have translated the practices into usable information, we have collected user evaluations of the practices and how useful they are. So that social validity information is in an article that we published actually this year, and Sam is the first author, and it's about dissemination of evidence-based practices in Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. We have another article in JAD that is accepted, and it's not online yet, was of that RCT that in which we designed an approach. We designed an intervention model for teachers that would promote teachers' use of evidence-based practices. And we do have social validity information for the whole model, but not for the individual practices. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. And I do remember reviewing a few articles, and I remember it was not necessarily part of the criteria, which I think makes sense for this review. So thank you, appreciate it.
So not to extract any promissory notes from you, but I know you mentioned in the next steps doing similar work in young adults or in adults. Is that something your group is doing, or do you know if anybody's planning on doing a similar review for adults?
Well, I mentioned the National Standards Project, excuse me, the National Standards Project, which is part of the National Autism Center in Massachusetts. They have expanded their review to include adults, interventions for adults. So that was that examination was in their last report, which was published in I think around 2015. So they had done also a comprehensive review, sort of like ours, and we have looked at the two reviews and seen overlaps between the two, but in our age range, we just didn't go beyond 22. We would love to be able to both expand our review up to, into adulthood if we had the funding. It always comes down to funding to be able to to do this work. The other thing that we would like to do is to make this review an ongoing process rather than waiting, for 5 years and trying to catch up on the literature that has happened, in that previous half decade. But again, that's kind of dependent on funding also. So we are interested in young adults. I want to give a shout out to a program that we've done in high schools here in San Diego and in North Carolina and in Wisconsin. It's called the CISA program, Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism, which we're now in a follow-up phase right now. But the research team here worked in 20 high schools in the areas, and it developed a comprehensive program that happened in 10 of those 20 high schools, because it was an RCT also, randomized clinical trial.
I'm going to give a plug for a presentation that we're going to do on CISA that's part of Captain. I know that Anne is on the call, and so we'll be giving a presentation, Bonnie Kramer and I, in March on the CISA project. So I'll let you all know about that.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So there was another question in the chat from Anne. When might we expect the AFIRM modules to be updated and made available?
I would like to say soon, but again, we don't have really any funding to do that. The Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute is a kind of a soft money, but not kind of, it is a soft money operation. So everything we do is based on funding sources to allow us to do the work. We're hoping that that we would be able to update the modules if we can find a funding source. But at this point, I can't say specifically when that would happen. I wish I had a better answer for that.
Are there any other questions?
If somebody wants to raise a hand or type their question, but I'm just gonna, I would like to thank you so much for this presentation. Again, I've learned so much, if only the scope of this work that you have had to review 3 times apparently over the decades. But this has been very educational and informational for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I think other people are thanking you in the chat as well.
Thanks very much.
Let us all hope for good news tonight and for a pleasant end of this nightmare.
Yeah, I know.
Not the presentation at all, not referring to the presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending on such a stressful day, and let's hope to meet during more optimistic and better times next time.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.